Welcome to the Roadman Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I want to deconstruct what it means to be an effective top athlete. And the way I was thinking about this, I was recently listening to a podcast. If you haven't listened to it and you're into history podcasts, The Dictators, absolutely brilliant. I'm addicted to it. But there's an episode about Napoleon. And it got me thinking about the similarities between war generals and coaches. And there's actually more than you might think. You know, we obviously have the tactics, and that's Napoleon deploying his men and saying, okay, you're going into this field and you're going to fight hand to hand. But that's only really relevant to a specific battle. If you zoom out from the tactics, you have the strategies, and they have broader applicability into different eras, different battles. And that's kind of the way I've been thinking about this conversation today. I want to focus more on the strategies, because if we get too deep into the tactics of, you know, Blummenfelt and Gustav, Iden, that's not applicable to almost any other athlete in the world. But if we zoom out and we talk strategies, I think age group athletes, runners, cyclists, swimmers, you know, the kind of weekend have-a-go heroes, we can all take something from this conversation. So to start off that kind of wider themed conversation, I'd like to know if you have a guiding philosophy as a coach that helps guide your approach to training athletes.
I think that in order to reach peak human performance, you basically need to have both athletes and coaches or staff around that all have the same determination, the same goal, the same determination to reach there. Otherwise, they very easily become an imbalance in things, because becoming the best, it really requires some priorities that I think even at world-class level is sometimes hard to really understand or grasp what that actually means. So for me, this actually boils down to a little bit, of course, I need to be motivated. So it's also about, okay, what is the goal there? And I have to say, I'm not motivated by like medals is for let's say that's more for, let's say, the confirmation that we did good. What motivates me more on a deeper level and makes me want to continue and just see how far we can push the barriers is actually more about this personal journey where you are learning more and more and getting deeper into the understanding of what really is defining peak human performance. What are the limitations? Have we found them? How far are we from that? But I think that to be able to enable a culture or strategy where this is successful, you also need to find people that are like-minded or that buys into that same approach and are willing to dedicate them to the same. Because if we have a little bit, like, say, different so if you draw it back to the analogy of war, I think that if you have people that don't really believe in, let's say, that goal, or let's say that battle that are there, and you don't think you can win, or that the tactic or the strategy that is behind that is the right one, I think that people will never go into war with let's say with the feeling or buy-in, or call it being convinced that they actually can win. And that's a part that very often is hard to quantify. We are very good at quantifying the physiological parts of performance, but we don't have the same tools very often about for let's say for the psychological part. And that's where I believe that you can't give an instruction to an athlete, just say do this without that you are also educating them on the topic so that they really understand what they are going to do. And at the same time, again, back then to I wander off a little bit now, but to try to bring it back, I think in order to have a successful strategy, it is a combination of finding a goal and goals and people that believes in the same strategy or the same approach towards that goal. And that's why I think that there is of course we have these awards or recognitions where people say, oh yeah, you're a brilliant endurance coach and so on. Yes, maybe for some athletes, but I don't believe for all athletes, because other athletes might have other needs, and that might be too far away from, let's say, what motivates me in a way of coaching. And that means that those people would not necessarily be the ones that I would be able to succeed with either. So I think that you have to build a team, or you have to find a team and athletes and staff and so on that basically believes in the same goals and the same way to get there, to be successful.
It's interesting because this ties in very closely with how I think about the starting point for an athlete. If I'm talking to an athlete at the very beginning of their journey, I think there's a couple of things I like to consider. I think about their previous experience. Are they coming from maybe a high level in another sport and now they're just coming into this new sport? Like they've been an Olympic rower and now they're just stepping across to triathlon. Also looking at their starting point. What's your current fitness? And when you look at that collectively as, we call it point A, and you look at where they want to go, we'll call this point B. So they say, I want to win Kona. Depending on the gap in between to get from A to B is your level of commitment. And if you have a mismatch from where they are to where they want to go with their level of commitments, like if you have an athlete that comes in with no historic background as a cyclist or triathlete, age 35, they're a bad starting point in terms of their fitness, and they say to you they can train 8 hours a week, but they want to win Kona inside 4 years. Intuitively, you just go, well, that's not going to happen. We know that's not going to happen based off data, but it gets more nuanced in that gray zone in the middle where you have someone that comes in that's like, okay, I want to win or podium in an age group national championships and I have 12 hours a week. How do you think about that sort of starting point for someone? It's always helped me to think about it as a GPS analogy in a car. When you get into the car, the GPS wants to know a couple of data points. Where are we? Where do we want to go? And then it can plot the journey in between.
I think that's a very good analogy. And I think exactly because maybe even more so on an athlete level, one thing is like committing to a goal, but it's really not the goal that you are committing to. What you're committing to is the process. Getting to the goal, because the goal is just like a minor energy consumption or dot in your calendar compared to all the process that goes from where you are today exactly to get to that goal. And that's where so what you really are buying into, or what you really have to have a buy into, is the process and methods that is required to get there. What does it require in terms of commitment to the everyday training, the process, everything around there to facilitate that in the best possible way? And of course, if you just aim to go to Kona and you are in a fairly good shape, you can probably do quite a bit of, or you can. It doesn't require the same level of commitment, but for to win, especially at the elite level, where there's a lot of people that really are fighting for the same goal, then it comes down to, in the end, priorities. It comes down to priorities and how, but not only priorities, because I think if those priorities requires a lot of discipline and it's not very motivating to do it, I think you'll always have a little bit of a disadvantage compared to somebody that are able to find joy actually and a meaning in that process moving forward.
That's really interesting, because I was actually speaking to someone about this the other day. I still ride my bike maybe 15 hours a week, and I'm not trying to be pro. I run most days. I'll ride the bike most days. And someone was saying to me, like, why are you doing split sessions? Why are you riding the bike so much? And I was trying to say the difference between a pull and a push motivation. I'm not pushing myself to do this. There's something about the sport that actually pulls me in, that I have to do it. It almost magnetizes me into do it, because I can't enjoy other areas of my life, as weird as that sounds. I don't enjoy sitting down and watching a Netflix movie with my girlfriend in the evening if I haven't trained that day. And I think there's definitely, I'm not sure where that switch is in athletes, but I've seen athletes with push and pull motivations, and someone that's trying to push themselves to get out of bed every morning. Typically, they don't last very long in sport.
I think it sums it very well. You really, but I think also exactly like this joy. It's not maybe to define maybe that joy a little bit, or that's maybe hard to define joy. I think we all we know what joy is when we experience joy. But I think that what I think is fairly universal is that when we feel there is a match between what we want and the process, or let's say the tactics, I think that then it's much easier exactly to be pulled out of that bed every morning, because there's something that resonates with you. When there is this push, this is where there is not necessarily, there's just only a goal like very far in the future. And you don't necessarily have that goal every day. There's maybe not that tactic, or let's say that goal for that day, the purpose of that single day that resonates with you. And that means also that the quality of the execution that day, both in training and outside training, will probably already not provide the same result as if you had that pull that came out and you were fully dedicated to that day and doing your best that day, making the best of the situation, and enjoying the process, enjoying the journey. So when you're traveling from A to B in your car, one thing is the goal in forward, but it's that trip goes so fast from A to B, you even lose track of time if you are really enjoying that journey.
Music's up, windows down.
So that's why I think having this kind of buy-in is super important, and I think that will always, you might have the best pros, or you might maybe have the best technology, you might have the best methods or ability to or you have the best data or instruments or whatever, but if you don't leverage that data in a way that resonates with the athletes, it's much harder. Exactly, then it becomes like this push config that you use as a metaphor, as opposed to if there's something and there is something in the data here. This really makes sense to me. Today, when I'm on the bike, I'm going to focus exactly on these kind of tasks there, and hopefully that will turn out also that I actually also get a positive reinforcement, seeing that the data actually aligns with there, and you see that you actually are getting closer and closer and closer towards that goal, or basically bridging up that gap that you have identified as needed in order to win in Kona.
So how do you think about the starting point, defining what that is? Is it a physiological assessment? Is it a battery of physiological assessments? And just even before you jump in to answer that, I'm defining starting point as a new athlete who you're working with for the first time. So you want to get a snapshot of where they're at, or else even the likes of Kristian and Gustav, who come back after one season, take a little bit of a break, and now they're transitioning into the next season.
So I hear there would be, of course, be a difference whether you are working with an athlete over a longer time. So you basically you define, let's say, a starting point of a season, but you also have then a lot of history for that athlete, and then let's say the end point of that season versus the start point of that season, or let's say the end point of last season versus the start point of the new season, very often is only maybe a couple of weeks away apart as well. So there's not something like very new information that comes up there. But let's say for an athlete, if there would be an athlete so if I were to start to work with a new athlete or a coach, for that sake, that's maybe more my situation than necessarily working with an athlete. But if I work with, let's say, a business leader, or I work with an elite coach, I would typically very often sit down first and understand a little bit where they are. So it's a part both, let's say, okay, how are they working? So let's call it that, the physiological or hard part of it. And then you have the soft part, or more the psychological part of it. And that is basically, what are their motivation? Because it doesn't help if I come in as a mentor and I just have a very strong opinion on the process and these kind of things and what they should do, unless, again, it doesn't resonate with their motivation. So I think the starting point for me is always of course, I might have an idea in my head what is required to reach the end goal based on past experience. But I need to understand a little bit, where are they and how do they think, and and how do they see the process getting to the end goal there. And I think that for successful coaches and business owners, very often they have done a lot right to get where they are. And that's also where one have to be humble, that there are many ways to the end goal. Surely the more we are reaching towards peak human performance or peak business or whatever it is, the more narrow, let's say, the less possibilities there are to do things like very radically different there, because you need to become more efficient. But for me, the starting point would always be with understanding maybe more the psychological part of where they are, what are their motivations, what motivates them, and so on. And then I have to understand more, okay, in order now to bridge that gap between there, because the reason why I am now into that role as a mentor or as a coach is exactly then to have that overview, let's say that helicopter perspective, and see, okay, these are the things that they are doing, and then rather identifying where can we raise the quality more. So not necessarily revolutionizing or changing, making big changes in these kind of things. It's more about making, let's say the small steps in those places that maybe feels most rewarding in the beginning, and that is very often about raising the quality, not changing a lot of things, but raising the quality rather of certain aspects of what they do. And then as they actually maybe also then feels that, okay, this actually makes a change, that creates again joy, excitement, and then it's much easier to have a new buy-in into, let's say, the next task and the next task and so on. Because if you just come in and you're going to revolutionize things, most people will then back off a little bit, or they don't even tell you. They just sit there and they just nod their head and said, yes, this sounds very logical and everything like this, but you don't get the buy-in. And in order to win a war, win that gold medal, win in business life, you really need people to be extremely determined, and they're just investing everything they can into towards that goal there, or that process to getting towards that goal there. And that's where they also find their joy. They're not making a sacrifice. They are making priorities, but they don't make sacrifices per se, because they don't perceive it as a sacrifice. But if you start to make big changes to something, then you might end up coming into that situation where you're starting to feel that you're sacrificing maybe ways or things that motivates you when you are working or in the way you're working. And then that's where you can still become good by discipline and pushing somebody all the time. But I don't think you will become the best that way. And that's
I haven't heard that approach to it. It's brilliant. So before you even taking the athlete track, before you even start to look to compile data on physiologically where this person is at, you want to get in and understand them psychographically, figure out what makes them tick. And in that way, then if we move to the next step of where you've collected some physiological data, you've collected your psychographic data, does the results of both of those, do they determine the structure of a macro training plan? Or is that a training plan that's kind of, you have a philosophy, whether it's reverse periodization or otherwise, and then every athlete goes through this sort of macro training block, or is it unique for each athlete?
No, I would say it's let's say the strategy or let's say the method on a high level would of course be pretty much the same, and by that I mean that when you are by that I mean that or to give an example, I would very, very often how I like to work is more like you need to identify that gap. So of course that is already a method. You need to find a gap, and that you have to, and the way to find that is by defining, okay, this is the goal or the end point, this is the starting point. And then you need to understand get an idea of what is needed there. And I very often like to do that by saying, okay, this is we know, or we have a pretty clear understanding of that this is the requirement to get, or to, let's say, to use a very concrete example, business is very often a little bit more gray or more difficult, because there are many more facets to that. Because how do you define? Because it defines, or it's more about how do you find what is the business goal, and that can be much more. That you have more flexibility in determining that than you have to for winning Kona. Winning Kona is by being the fastest athlete from A to B, so it is extremely measurable, as opposed to, for example, if you want to be successful in business, you can maybe say, okay, it's about having the best or largest turnover, most income, growing the business X amount of percents, and so on. So, but there it comes more down to, let's say, that goal that is there and understanding that gap there. In sports, this is already predefined what the goal is if you want to win. Is basically this time it takes to cover the distance from A to B. But then to use the athlete example here to simplify it, that means that we know what time is required to win in Kona, and that we can look at statistics. We can just look at what are the numbers over the last 5-10 years, for example, because of course there are factors influencing the time it will take to cover from A to B, like weather conditions and so on. But when you already have this idea, you have the statistics there, you can already start to factor that into your training. You know that you need this much room. Or let's say that on the fastest day possible, which you use that as a benchmark, you just say, okay, we have to be able to go this fast. And then when you have defined that, you can start to look at, okay, how fast are you today? And now you have a percentage difference there. And then I would say, okay, in order for us to have a believable or really believe that we are where we are, we can't test whether we are good enough on a race day. We should already know weeks, months before that we are already there, preferably. So that we basically we can just really build confidence and everything around going into that race day. But then when I already have that defined, then it's more about the gap, and then it's more like, okay, how do we get there? And that comes then where I start to do more like physiological profiling, other types of profiling, more or less, to understand, let's say, where are we getting the largest returns of investment? Because again, like exercising is an investment. You're investing time into something that should improve you. And this is universal, whether you're an elite athlete or whether you are a newbie even. So even if you train 3 hours a week, it's not like, okay, you're only training 3 hours a week. Yeah, well, then it doesn't matter. Of course, it matters. The reason why you train 3 hours a week is because you want to improve and you want to have maximum results for those 3 hours you invest. The main difference between an elite athlete and an amateur, and even, like say, just people that likes to train for wellness, is mainly just the requirement to precision in what you do. Because what happens is that as you scale up a program and the volume in the program gets larger, the requirement to precision grows exponentially. That is the reason why when you come up to, you can probably get up to 10 hours a week. You can probably do quite a lot of strange things and you still have good improvements for a while before you really have to start to become more precise or to get out the last percentages of those 10 hours you invest. 20 hours, then now things can go bad if you start to be sloppy with your intensity control and these kind of things. Over a week, you end up not getting consistency in your training because you get too exhausted and other things. You start to lack improvement. And at 30 hours, you basically don't have any room for errors, really, because then also injuries, burnouts, and other things can also be very soon a reality if you basically dig yourself. Because people that train 30 hours a week, those people are extremely determined. They are very ambitious to be able also to put in those 30 hours a week of training. And that means also that those people won't stop necessarily if they have a bad feeling a day. They will just continue. And just almost like some of the athletes I work with is more like, okay, it feels a little bit bad today. Probably I just run faster and I run that pain off. That's of course putting it a little bit rough, but back to the profiling and understanding this and what kind of method or what kind of approach. To sum that up, I would say that for me, the way I normally work is more like I work from a reversed. Not reverse extrapolation to bring in it, because that's for me more a tactic, something you believe in. You believe in a reverse extrapolation. I don't believe necessarily that there is one single periodization. It depends on the athlete. It depends on several factors and the way to identify what would be the best approach to bring an athlete from let's say, that starting point towards that goal, or let's say that win in Kona. That boils down to, for me, let's say, a series of assessments or observation to understand the athlete, understand what we can measure, and then seeing where do we have the most, where will we gain most of investing our time now moving forward. That will then change. That's why it's important also to do regular checkups. In the same way you do accounting for a business, you wouldn't. There's a reason why we release quarterly reports, and that's because if you basically said, "I don't care about accounting," you start your business January 1st, and at December you're going to look into your accounts. If you haven't kept a track of anything in your accounts at all, how can you know how to optimize your business? Where are money just leaking out, and are you earning any money at all? Or are you suddenly in a big debt? So I think for me, I'm much more. My tactics are very flexible, and there I like to have a large repertoire. That's more for me the learning, where you learn when you meet other people, coaches. We advance research and this kind of thing. You get a more richer and richer toolbox where you can employ different tactics to fulfill that strategy. And for me, the strategy is more how or which tactic do you decide to employ in order to maximize the likelihood for that you will be able to reach your goal, if that makes sense.
So how do you approach gaps? If you identify a gap, do you approach it by addressing the weakness, or do you approach it by doubling down on the strength? I think this is where cycling-specific training and triathlon maybe diverge, because with cyclists, you identify a weakness. Okay, I'm not very good at climbing, and a strength, I'm a super fast finisher. So you double down, you put all your chips into the I'm a fast finisher bucket, and now you become an out-and-out sprinter. But if the terrain doesn't suit for today, you just write that race off and you go, okay, well, I'm not going to win that race. I sit up and I finish in the gruppetto for today. That's not quite the same for triathlon, I think.
I would say it is. I wouldn't say there are any difference, because I think this comes down more to the view, or let's say how flexible you also think that physiology is as well. For me, I would say that what I would be focusing on, whether that's strength or weakness, comes down rather more to where we think there's the most to be gained. Because again, we are investing time, we're investing hours, we're investing resources into improve. And for example, if I identified that investing the same amount of time into improving that weakness versus trying to improve a strength, and we think that actually there are much more likelihood that we will improve here by working on that weakness there. I would rather focus on that weakness and then improve that first, and then again it becomes a new assessment. What are now the gaps? Because I don't think that you can do like a gap analysis like once a year. You need to, all these tools, you need to keep them updated. It's like accounting of a business. You need to keep track of what is changing, how is the response, business to the market. In sports, how do you respond to the training stimulus? To see basically that you always are investing your time and resources where you're getting the most out of it. Because I think that if you just double down on for example, just maintaining or trying to improve a strength, for example, you potentially lose out on quite a lot of improvements, in the same way that if you just focus on a weakness, improving a weakness, and you don't understand whether that is really the best place to invest your time and resources, you might also, you might improve a little bit, but you would be better off focusing on something completely different. So again, this is where I have a more holistic approach about it, and it's more about where do we see the largest return on investment. It is really as simple as that, how say philosophically speaking, or let's say strategically speaking. But of course, the difficulty is understanding how to improve. What tactics do you use? What tools do you use in order to improve that? That's where you start to get more into the nitty-gritty details, and you really have to be precise on what you do. So I personally prefer much more having a holistic approach, and I don't have a determination of what and how. It comes more down to where do we think is the most to be improved compared when we look at the gap. And then it's more about figuring out how do we improve that? And sometimes so sometimes you have past experience with addressing it. Other times you just see that here there are potentially a big gain to be made, and this is where you just have to learn new skills. But that's the goal of a coach anyway, or a mentor anyway, is that we are the ones that are supporting the person that is executing, so that person can have full focus on executing, while we look at, okay, how can we improve the execution?
What a catch. Roadman, you know how serious I take my goal setting, and I know how serious you take it too. So whether you're chasing fitness or lifestyle goals, and you're looking for a powerful ally to support you on this journey, look no further than Huel. Huel has become my secret weapon for when I don't have time to prepare a balanced meal. It means I get the nutrition I need without sacrificing time or taste. Plus, it stops me from reaching for the takeaway menu. I always throw a bottle of this banana into my backpack when I'm heading into the city, and it stops me eating junk convenience foods that don't support my training goals. It's handy, it's nutritious, it's 22 grams of protein. It's perfect for athletes that don't have time to cook or prepare food before a training session. It's convenient, nutritious fuel at your fingertips, ensuring you hit your daily fueling needs. Huel Ready to Drink has over 26 essential vitamins and minerals in every bottle, making sure you get 175 health benefits. Plus, it's made from amazing natural ingredients like sunflower seed, coconut, and more. And the best part, 8 mouth-watering flavours. My favourite's the banana. That's what's in my backpack at the moment. You can get Huel direct to your home by going to huel.com/roadman. That's Huel, HUEL.com/roadman. So let's zoom into a micro block now. We talked kind of broad strokes about the macro block. Into the micro block, a lot of cyclists in World Tour land, reverse periodization has got quite popular at the moment, where the off season is looking like a 4-month block where there's testing at the beginning of block 1, and block 1 focuses on sprinting, and then there's retesting of sprinting in the decompression week at the end of the 4th week. Then it moves on to VO2 max with the same formula, testing at the start and testing at the end for 4 weeks, then into threshold, and then into endurance, which is the opposite to how we worked for a long, long time. But I chatted to the kid who won Barcelona and Mallorca this year, Yuri Kulin. And Yuri doesn't seem to follow any structure like this. He kind of stays on all year round. But it was interesting to me how he structured his week, where he has full VO2 max days. So he'll have a Tuesday where his swim, his bike, and his run are all VO2 max sessions that day. And for me, that was just horrific sound, and I couldn't get my head around how you get out of bed that morning knowing you've 3 VO2 max sessions to do that day. What's your philosophy on that microstructure? How do you approach it?
Again, so there's one philosophical part of it, and then there, of course, is the let's say the practical part of it. The philosophical part of it is more what you think is needed. What do you think is needed for a microstructure to be to achieve as high as possible quality in that microstructure? And by quality, I'm not talking about intensity. I'm talking about purely like progress, whether that is low intensity, medium intensity, high intensity. Because for me, like quality and intensity are two different things, because you want to have the maximum quality both in your low intensity sessions, your medium intensity session, and your high intensity sessions. Put it a little bit bluntly, like is your low intensity ride a low quality ride? Does it? What are you doing? And like, are you mindless about or actually are you mindful about what you also do in your low intensity sessions? But when it comes to microstructure, like I think that there is a lot of value in, for example, repeating patterns. Simply because if you have a mindful athlete, at least, is that when you are in a session, you will very quickly identify, okay, what are my or how am I executing on the purpose of this ride or this session today? And when you know that you have another session coming up, let's say at a repeating pattern, for example, that allows you then to if the mindset is exactly that, there's no failure. Like if you said, okay, you're going to hit this power target today, and if you don't hit that, then you have failed. again, of course, I don't believe many people do that way, but it's more like to just exaggerate a little bit, then of course that's not very motivating. But if every session is about making, or let's say advancing, and advancing is not only about advancing intensity or certain power, but it's also about efficiency. It's about how you, improving different kind of skill sets. I think that there is always learning. You can even like a bad session, you can learn quite a lot from if you are mindful about, okay, what did I execute? Why weren't I able to execute here as planned? And then you actually take that learning and you take that and you use it as a way of improving on that next session there. And that's much easier if you know there's a structure. And there's a repeating pattern. I think that is important. Secondly, when it comes to intensity, I think that it's very sometimes easy to forget that we are all subjects to some fundamental laws of nature. And one of them is that for example, you can't create and you can't destroy energy. You can only convert energy from one form to another form. And that's why I'm also very careful about causing too large depths or energy depths or deficits over longer period. And that means also even in a microcycle, yes, there can be some microcycles where we are, let's say, creating a larger depth, but you at least have to have also then a very clear strategy on how you're going to pay back that depth afterwards.
Just to jump in on this, because I think there's a lot of confusion about this, because this is something we're seeing in the last few years where we used to talk about, chronic training load and acute training load, or even normalized power over a specific duration. And the vocabulary's changed a little bit more to talking around kilojoules now. Can you anchor this for us and maybe explain why this vocabulary has emerged and kind of simplify it so people can understand what we're actually talking about here?
So ultimately, of course, it's covering a distance, but the problem a little bit with that is that it's very hard to anchor that in ultimately calories, because in the end, again, I'm going to exaggerate to just make a point, and that is that if there's no velocity without power, there's no power without calories. Simple as that. Yes, the body is a battery, so it means basically that you can go out and you can do a certain run, and you can even do a good run, but it's just a matter of time for how many times you can do that, because before your battery is empty, unless you actually start to feed in properly also in the other end of it. And that also ties back into that I think that today talking about relative values like power per kilogram and or watts per kilogram or VO2 max as a milliliters per minute per kilogram, for example, you're shifting the focus on when you are stagnating a little bit. Instead of looking at, okay, where can I now improve, you rather think, okay, I have to reduce my weight. And the flaw with starting to reduce your weight is that we are organic creatures. And in order for anything organic to grow, you need food in, you need in energy there. But the problem is that we are also very like, what's the English word or English term, but it's called when, for example, like a dog. If a dog do something right, you give him a treat straight afterwards. If a dog do something right and that treat comes an hour later, the dog has no clue about what that treat is for. And we are also, even though we like to think that we are advanced creatures, we are not that advanced when it comes to these kind of things. We are very, very much inclined towards having like an immediate reward of something. And the problem there is that it's very easy to see that, yes, if you're reducing your kilograms, yes, potentially then the watts per kilograms goes up, or your VO2 max or measured as milliliter per minute per kilogram also goes up. But the thing is that if you measure this as watts per kilogram, yes, it will look like this, but you have already started a down spiral because you are now starting to inhibit that growth or that is so important for the continued growth. Because instead of trying to be smart about how you do the training, you start to overly focus on, we are stagnated, our program must be perfect, so it can only be done now by reducing the weight. No, most likely it's about looking at what can you do with the stimulus, what can you do smarter in your program, and still make sure that there is a calorie at least balance, or preferably a slight surplus even, to continue to promote growth. And that but how do we then quantify it? How do we know this? the thing is that also when we've done several tests, or I don't know now, over a decade more or less, is that we also have seen that when you are reduced, so yes, you can improve your watts per kilogram, but the interesting finding that we almost find every time as well is that actually that relative VO2 goes down at the same time. So it's easy to think, well, if watts per kilogram goes up, most likely also your VO2 max measures, relatively speaking, so basically milliliters per kilogram also goes up. But that's not the case. We very often see the opposite. And that is that it goes down, and it actually goes even faster down. So your absolute VO2 max comes down, but your relative one, it doesn't actually go up. So you can imagine, okay, fine, maybe we can sacrifice a little bit on the absolute VO2 max, but as long as weight comes down more, that will give you a higher relative VO2 max. But that's not the case. And of course, this is something that is limited to those teams or individuals that have access or the resources to do either this kind of testing in a proper way, or they even buy this equipment. Of course, now it's being democratized. So companies like VO2 Master and so on are making this technology more available to the masses. But I think back to how we are looking at like loading and these kind of things. The problem with distance is that distance in a pool is very controllable. So there you can, if you have measured VO2 max there a couple of times, or you measure oxygen consumption there a couple of times, you can have a there won't be big difference between that your oxygen consumption, basically then calorie consumption, when you're swimming a certain velocity. So if you have measured VO2 at certain different velocities, you can basically use it as for a fairly good period, and from that you can plan, okay, this is the distance we're going to swim, this is the velocity we're going to swim at. That basically means that's going to have this kind of calorie demand. And then we're not talking about, because there is also something we call exercise or post-exercise oxygen consumption as well, but let's look away from that to make it not too complicated, because you can imagine after you're done with the training, there's a recovery process taking place, and that also requires an elevated calorie consumption compared to just basal metabolic rate. So distance in swimming, there is a very good correlation between because you're swimming in a pool back and forth, and conditions are extremely stable. When it comes to running, then things start to get a little bit more complicated, because you can have wind, other environmental factors that will have an influence, but not that much. But of course, starting to run uphill, downhill, and these kind of things, now distance is not as easy anymore, because distance is measured normally flat. So even if if you did a run today that was 10K, and tomorrow also, or let's say in 2 days' time, you do another 10K, there's a huge difference between running 10K flat and 10K uphill. Obviously, and those will have two very different energy demands as well. Cycling would be even worse than running. But the benefit we have in running, but also starting to have now in running as well, is we are getting power meters. And then we are starting to get one step, or let's say a fairly close step into being able to have a pretty good understanding of the energy demand. I would advise that not using kilojoules as a kilocalorie, because that's not right. There are bigger differences, but the correlation there stays. Whether you are cycling uphill now, whether you're running uphill, flat, and these kind of things, there is no a tighter correlation. Still, the energy demand will be different doing 1,000 kilojoules uphill versus doing potentially 1,000 kilojoules flat, because you're engaging maybe a little bit different muscle groups, you're working a little bit differently, but the differences are now getting smaller as opposed to comparing 10K uphill versus 10K flat. So the whole goal, of course, with kilojoules is to try to make something a little bit more like universally applicable now, independently of conditions, so that we have a better understanding of what is the energy demand there, what do we need to fuel for, and to make sure that we are in balance for. And of course, again, if you can use portable metabolic analysis, then you are as close as you can get to the Holy Grail, and that is understanding exactly what is the calorie demand, randomly measured over a week at different intensities and sessions and during rest. And you can be extremely accurate on that to make sure exactly that you promote optimal fueling for optimal growth, and then to adapt to that stimulus that you're providing to your body.
But does efficiency levels matter? Because I think we've all had that experience where we started out cycling or running and we went out for 2 hours and we needed to replace almost every kilojoule we burned during the session just to get through the session. But then you fast forward a number of years and you can go out with seemingly no food and feel perfect all the way through it. How does that efficiency and economy play into kilojoules?
So this is where I would differentiate between substrate utilization and efficiency, because efficiency, of course, is fairly well defined in physics, as where you are improving the ratio between the input and output. But of course, as humans, we can say that, okay, to use more let's say general terms, anaerobic and aerobic, we can say that we very often say that utilization, if you can increase your utilization of fats, for example, by improving, for example, your anaerobic threshold as a function of your VO2 max. That means, of course, that one, you can now go at a higher power for longer time while tapping predominantly into your fats or using fats as a substrate. You will still use glycogen, but it will be marginal as opposed to when you're untrained and you go out and almost like you don't have very much room before you're already starting to come around that threshold, and that means you're already now starting to use a lot of carbohydrates. And we know that carbohydrates are much more limited resource in the human body than fats are. But it's the most efficient one as well. It's a super efficient fuel source, but there are some reasons why the body doesn't store as much carbs as fats. But that means that exactly as you're getting more trained, you're getting more efficient. There are two things happening. Surely you're just getting more, you're getting stronger, so you can bike faster or with a higher power output for longer periods. But the second part is also that exactly that you're for at least for endurance sports, what will happen versus from an untrained to a trained athlete is that you are increasing also now the substrate utilization, favoring burning more fats, also up at a higher relative percentage of your maximum power outputs. This is actually the interesting thing, because if you train as a sprinter, I'm not talking now about the Tour de France sprinter, because a Tour de France sprinter is really not a sprinter. He's still an extreme endurance athlete. It's just more like a domain-specific term we have to try to classify the differences, the small differences that are between the time triathlete and the sprinter in Tour de France. But all of them are extreme endurance athletes. A sprinter, like for example, 100-meter runners, 100-meter swimmers, track cyclists, 1K track cyclists, and so on. There, actually, what happens there is that there you'll actually end up with a lower threshold. So, for example, if you went out with the fastest sprinters, for example, in running in the world, they would actually they wouldn't necessarily be more, call it efficient, but this is where you can't say it efficient, because movement efficiency is extremely high with them. So they're extremely efficient in turning those calories into forward propulsion. But their substrate utilization is heavily skewed towards the anaerobic resources, meaning that basically their threshold speed starts to become quite low. So even for an age grouper could probably go out and beat like a true sprinter or track cyclist on a threshold session, just because they are trained to basically like pour in as much resources independently of where that comes from, to be able to turn around as high as possible power outputs per time. That means basically that you're not only you're always using all resources, but the difference is that they want to have as much of all resources at the same time in order to be able to do as much work per time, in order to move as fast as possible per time. And that's, of course, not very, call it, substrates or carb, or let's say anaerobic, that it's not very, call it, endurance friendly.
So when we used to use training stress score to quantify a daily training load, but then maybe also have training stress score weekly tallies that we're shooting after. Is there still a role for training stress score, or are you moving to like a kilojoule target for individual sessions and weekly targets?
Actually, I've never used training stress score or TSS or IF or normalist power because, again, I come more from an engineering background in physics, and when we have the holy grail, the holy grail for any physics system is to measure the real input and output, and then understanding the efficiency in between there. And I've always worked that way, where I want to have the raw metrics. I don't want modeled data, because at the moment you start to take raw metrics or raw data and you're putting into these kind of like weighted metrics, or TSS, you are dumbing down the data and you're actually making it less useful than what it really is. In some sense, when you're starting to learn a sport or you're starting to learn something, then it's fine to have sometimes you just need some easy goals or easy tools for communicating something, and they can maybe have a role. But I still think then it's far better to establish that in real physics instead, and rather than build the understanding on top of that or the nuances on top of that. So for me, I rather like to work with distance per time, work per time, and energy per time.
I talked with Dr. Dan Plews on the podcast, and we spoke about this 3-week on, 1-week decompression model. And his view was that if you need a 1-week total decompression, you've totally got the first 3 weeks wrong, that you've overreached in the first 3 weeks. So he advocates a rolling heart rate variability assessment. So he's using HRV and using a running total of HRV to determine what days hard sessions should be done, what days easier endurance aerobic sessions should be done, and what days total recovery days should be applied. Are you using anything like this?
No. We measure HRV, but for me that is something that I would place in a layer. So of course I don't want to say that doesn't work or that is wrong. Proof is in the pudding, and if it works for them, that's good. That's fine. Then they found their way of communicating. Let's say their plans and schedules and being able to see progress. But again, I would say that ultimately, what we all are measured on in the end is distance per time. Simple as that. Nobody can avoid that, whether you're using HRV or whether you're using calories or whatever. It still boils down ultimately to distance per time. But HRV, like how I work on more is like I have my performance model, or like what I call a performance model, and that is, of course, I have distance per time, work per time, and energy per time. Much in the same way that I would approach on a Formula One car or a sailboat or whatever. That is, that there's an energy input, and there is some distance that you want to cover. That's how you race on a track, and there's a certain kilometers you need to cover, and that has a certain cost. So that's how I like to put it. And then basically below that layer there, you can break that down to, let's say, some subcomponents. Because in order sometimes to improve, for example, work per time. So if you think about power is a function, or is a function of course, force and velocity, or you basically can say cadence and torque. And then you have already broken into two components. So, for example, if we want to see, okay, how can we increase the power output for this athlete? One first is just that you're looking at, okay, like a really good program that promotes progress into that program, and measure then as increased power for a given duration, for example, or same power for a longer duration, for example. That would be like a very simple way to quantify progress for an athlete, and you can basically see when an athlete starts to stall, or maybe even if they start to backtrack a little bit, like again, and this would then require you to understand better why is this happening now. But then at some point you maybe even want to optimize on how you deliver that power or that work as well, and that could be then where you're looking at cadence and torque. So now you're looking at, okay, what you're building a cadence torque profile or a force velocity profile in order now to see, okay, you have some athletes that are they are more efficient at, let's say, higher cadence. Some are more efficient at a little bit lower cadences, for example. This is not static either, because this is, when I present it like this, then it's a one-dimensional view, because this will also change over a course of a race, for example, as well, because of fatigue and other things as well. But then you have some athletes that have a very pointy, for example, force velocity curve, some that have a more broader range that they can play over, and all this plays into, let's say, then different kind of strategy. And then you can break down, for example, force into subcomponents as well. You can break cadence into or cadence also into subcomponents. And for me, heart rate is something that sits, for example, on the energy side, because there we are measuring something physiologically that is happening in the body that is a part of, let's say, how the heart is operating, and the heart is, again, we have to remember a certain heart rate, you can say, is a function of a required oxygen. You need a certain amount of oxygen or calories, and in order to convert calories into work, you need to combust that. And we know that from the fire triangle, that in order to that to happen, you need temperature, you need something that you can combust, and in this case, then the substrates, carbs and fats, and then you need oxygen. And again, from physics, we have something called stoichiometry, and there we know how much oxygen is needed in order to release energy from fats or carbohydrates and so on. But then we can say, okay, there's a certain oxygen demand, and this sits so close exactly to calories that we can use this as a very good proxy exactly of how much calories that we're turning around per time, or how much energy we're turning around per time. But then in order to deliver that amount of oxygen, in order to combust those calories, then you need to deliver oxygen out to the muscles. And in order to deliver oxygen to the muscles, we have cardiac output. So cardiac output is how much blood is basically now being pumped out, or as it throughout your body. And that's, so you can always say you have VO2, then you have cardiac output that sits below there, and then below cardiac output we can split cardiac output into basically into stroke volume and ejection fraction and heart rates. And then below heart rate again, then you have HRV. So you're already now very far away, or into a very deep layer of a subcomponent, where basically also that the way that you deliver, just to put it this way, the way that actually you deliver a certain oxygen per time, you can break that also into, let's say, three main components. And that is basically how much oxygen do you extract per breath or per minute from the air that you're getting in. So how much are you taking out oxygen there? And then you have tidal volume and you have breathing frequency. And tidal volume is basically how much you're using your lungs per time. And then you have the breathing frequency. And these you can manipulate around in the same way as you have force velocity profile or cadence and torque. You can play around with it. If you go out and you think it and you say to somebody that are not used to, say, I want you now to go out and go as hard as possible for 5 seconds. Most people fall into the category where they just shift into a very big gear and thinking that it's torquing it around, like pushing like big gears and these kind of things. But the problem is that they don't get up into very high power, because you are not able, there's a certain limit to how much fibers you have and how much force production you are capable of doing. And that at some point, in order now to get a higher power, you need to find that higher cadence where you're able to have an effective coordination of your muscles as well to put out that high power. That's the same thing with our calories as well, with VO2 and with oxygen consumption. If you start to hyperventilate, that's not very good. Yes, you might have a good ventilation, but it's not a very good way to, you'll see that actually the ability to extract oxygen from the total volume of air that you're bringing into your lungs is not very efficient. So this is where you need to find an optimum between that. But the further you go down into this chain, the more variables will have an influence, and the body is extremely good at adapting. It's very good at adapting and compensating for the lack in one domain. It will basically improve in another domain and so on to find the simplest way to deliver a calorie. And HRV for me sits so far down into the chain there that it is a measure. It is a variable that we measure, but it's something I would only use as an indicator. So when I'm trying to understand something or getting deeper into, let's say, the potential reason or the cause for something, I could look into HRV to see if there is some information there that can lead to better intervention that basically promotes, in the end, better, energy delivery for the body.
So if we think about the function training is to get faster, so we have a stimulus plus a response, and that gives us the adaptation. So if a week of 7 days of training, someone could get a totally different response out of that training and a different adaptation out of that training depending on their readiness to train each specific day. Like if I'm super tired, but yet I'm forced to do a speed session, the adaptation is going to be different than if I'm super rested and I do the same speed session. So there may be strategic times where we want someone to do a speed session on very tired legs. But when you approach athlete readiness, and how do you look to determine what days are best to do what sessions? I've seen some coaches and I've read some papers where they talk about giving athletes not a prescription to do on each single day, but a weekly prescription and say, okay, here's the work you need to get through in 7 days. Now you self-determine which days you're going to do the sessions on, because the athlete will wake up and say, okay, I feel like I should go fast today. I feel like I should go long today. And often experienced athletes are quite in tune with, matching the right session with that right feeling. Do you use data to do this? Do you trust the athletes to do this? Or is it more of a collaborative process to figure out what to do when?
That is a collaborative process. And the reason for why it's a collaborative process is that one thing we also have to measure, of course, probably already went pretty, let's say into these different metrics in a way that most people are maybe not familiar with, and then it's easy to get scared a little bit, like, oh shit, I am not measuring all these kind of things. Am I losing out? Or okay, suddenly everything become much more complicated than it was before. Yes, elite athletes are very, but I think the key word here is often. I think that's the key word, often. And that's where relying on a single parameter or a couple of parameters or even all parameters that you can't quantify. There are more data that we still can't quantify than what we can quantify, because there is also a psychological aspect of this too. And I think that sometimes you just have to go out as well. And maybe I don't feel ready today. And then it's very easy to you don't go out. But sometimes you actually learn that when you go out a day, suddenly you're putting out your best numbers. And you're starting to think, so maybe that feeling that I have there, I have normally always perceived that maybe, I'm a little bit fatigued or anything like that. But maybe that's not a bad feeling at all. And maybe you'll change your view on that feeling as well. When you go out and one day and you actually start to really surprise yourself, which again is, of course, a very positive reinforcement and these kind of things. So for me, I wouldn't drive a program based on fixed metrics or a couple of metrics and these kind of things. This is a collaborative process where we would rather where we would try to have a healthy routine. I would probably, yes, some athletes probably will benefit from having this full flexibility. You just say, okay, these are the key sessions. You try to deliver as best as possible of them, and then you just let them organize that a little bit where they want it during the week. But then again, you might also end up in a situation that when you don't have it, you start to push it a little bit to when you should do it towards the end of the week, worst case, for example, or when it's not necessarily optimal because you decide to prioritize things that maybe you find more. Maybe you don't like the key session. You just know that you have to do the key sessions, and you push it away a little bit, with most tasks that are sometimes demanding for humanity. We like to sometimes push it forward, but or into the future. But I think that you have to look at this a little bit based on the athlete and find a structure that really works for you and that athlete. So I think to avoid making this too difficult or too complicated, I think exactly that the most valuable thing you have is, of course, starting to learn yourself. But don't accept a bad feeling for an excuse to don't do a workout. Go out and challenge yourself sometimes and actually be open to learn something new that maybe you actually didn't learn before because you decided to push it into the future or to keep it easy. And you can say that if the longer away you are from a competition or races, you can experiment a little bit more on these kind of things. When you're getting, let's say, into a more, let's say, central part of, let's say, your training and things have to go a little bit more, or where you need things to go a little bit more on rails, then I think take that learning with you in there and then employ best practice, what your coach would think and yourself as an athlete based on your emotions. And then when you get close into a race, this is when you can't have excuses anymore. This is the time, like when a race, you can't decide on race day whether you are going to feel like on top of the world, or whether you actually wake up and you feel like a little bit like you have a shitty day. And many people have woke up on race day and felt that they had a shitty day, and still they won the races. So you have to. This is also part of the learning, and this is where I would say that if a coach wants to use HRV, or they are using some other metrics and these kind of things, for me this is a little bit more like the language or terminology or whatever, and one can always discuss whether the terminology is right or wrong. But I don't think that matters. What matters is when you are developing, let's say, this sense. You're developing some senses, some intuition for what works and don't. And then I would say that a collaborative process of course, trying to get a more quantified or getting a better vocabulary or terminology or understanding of what should you do today. You're feeling this way today. Should we go out today and do this? And then because you have challenged yourself, you have, of course, some parts that say, yes, I know I actually can deliver on these kind of days. And sometimes I even surprise myself, maybe even go better. I think to summarize this, it's not very easy. It's not very easy. And I think it comes very much more down to what works for you. And don't be, because I think that if you just look at the best in the world, you have to remember that even if we write a book, or even if we talk in a podcast about, okay, how we are doing it, it's very easy to think, oh, that sounds brilliant. I want to adopt that kind of system there. But we also have to remember that what goes into writing of a book, there are 10 times, 100 times more, 1,000 times more that actually doesn't go into that book, that actually was vital to that, let's say, what resulted in that book there. And I think that's exactly where you just have to accept that there is a journey. Yes, get inspired, try to learn new things and these kind of things that you can bring in and you make your own understanding of. But in the end, I think it is much more important to find exactly what pulls you out of the bed in the morning, and that you get excited about, that you want to get out and do. And if that is, for example, using a new metric, well, that's good if that pulls you out of the bed, but don't lose focus on what the important things moving forward. And that's the goal and the excitement or joy that makes you want to get out in your running shoes or in the pool or biking.
But you're so right, because we've all had those days where we feel unexplainably good or unexplainably bad, despite the data and despite even our subjective feelings. Like I've woken up and I still have this kind of process of going through, like on a score of 1 to 5, how motivated do I feel to train today? How well do I feel I slept today? And I'm going to go through this little 10 questions that I ask myself before I check any of my wearable data. Sometimes they won't line up, but sometimes they'll all line up perfect. And I'll say, look, I feel horrible. And then I'll go out and I'll have a better race than I've ever had. And it's unexplainable because there's less data that we know that we don't know than we do know.
Exactly. I think that we of course we are working on of course we are using AIs and we are developing AIs now onto a very deep level to support us in both measured and non-measured, or call it inferred data. But and I have to say that ultimately I think that actually in the end we are just a bunch of atoms. We are, it sounds maybe a little bit harsh, but in the end we are atoms. They are basically just atoms, or even quarks, or you can say prions, but basically let's say atoms. That is what it is. So there are just molecules and atoms that are in the body, and there are chemical reactions as a function of that. And I think that ultimately we will be able to describe this mathematically, but it's still a long time in the future. But I think it is useful, of course, to try to quantify as much as possible with metrics to better be able to describe accurately a certain feeling or emotion and these kind of things. But exactly like you say, there are more things that we don't measure than what we measure. So we have to be humble about it. Data at the moment, yes, we are getting closer and closer to be able to describe more and more different feelings and emotions and be able to quantify that and together with performance and so on. But again, if you go completely blind on that, you lose out on so much valuable that again, this is a collaborative process.
Something I know that you're measuring that I know that I'm not measuring is core body temperature.
Yeah.
Talk to me about this. How does it work? Should I be doing it? Should listeners be doing it? And why are you guys doing it?
So I would say that there are many ways to. Of course, today they are starting to get different tools in the market and these kind of things that you can use to measure core body temperature. I think it's no secret that we have a very close collaboration with GreenTech or Core in Switzerland. They are making the white sensor that are very often attached to people's heart rate sensors or the Tour de France riders or triathletes. Yes, you should definitely measure this. The main motivation for me actually because we have used, I don't know, I probably spent 10,000-15,000 euros on temperature pills for Kristian and Gustav and Kenji. And some other athletes, but we did so much measurements leading into Tokyo over let's say between 2017 and 2021, leading into Tokyo Olympics to really refine our heat protocols, how to understand how the body responds and these kind of things. But what really caught and I like to measure something as let's say as close to the source as possible. So but the flaw, or not the flaw, the core body temperature, we have to remember, is a result of something, and that is work. And what most people don't think about is that for every calorie that you are actually burning in order to produce a certain power on your bike, for elites, that is around 20%, not 25%. It's closer to 20% for elites, actually. That means actually for every calorie, only 0.2 calorie is basically used for forward propulsion on your bike. And you think, what on earth? Where is the other 0.8? Where's the other 80% going? It's heat. And that heat that you do are basically showing up in two ways. One is exactly increased core body temperature, because you have muscles are internally in your body, and there's a lot of fluids running around in your body. Your blood is being, and that means basically that when the blood comes down into the muscles, it will be basically also come back up again in your body, or let's say up into your torso. So basically, it is distributed around in the body, and the body is, of course, an extremely advanced plumbing system, a dynamic or organic plumbing system. Or it basically is not a static like a tube in your house which just stays. It will even it will contract, and it will basically expand, and so many things to this. And also it will regulate this difference where it basically the blood vessels get contracted, and where it basically expands and so on, depending on whether it actually also needs to get rid with more heat, or actually if it needs to preserve heat in your body. That's why, for example, if you're out in the cold, we very often get first very cold on our extremities, because the body starts to sense that it's getting cold and it wants to protect you, and then it will basically start shutting down delivery of blood to the extremities, because one, you are losing more heat there, but also it's not a vital part of your body. So core.
Interesting. I didn't know that. That's a little bit of a segue, but so to get warmer hands, I could just wear a better base layer.
So the thing is actually, exactly. So the thing is actually that. The thing is actually that what really caught my eye with core, and it was actually a very good friend of mine, Dan Laurent, that actually pointed me in the direction of them, and to the CEO of GreenTech and Core, Wolf Glatz. And he's a physicist, actually. So they actually don't come from a place where they decide, oh, we're going to make some new brilliant sports tech. They actually come from the industry, and we are talking about where they deliver to aerospace and laser industry and so on. But they saw, hey, we have a brilliant technology here. This can be used for other applications, like, for example, measure core body temperature as well. And the way it does it is not like, you can go to the pharmacy or to the shop and you buy this thermometer that you use for rectal measurement, but you basically just scan your forehead, for example. The problem with them is that they take your skin temperature at a certain point, and then they apply an offset to that, because we know that skin temperature is lower than your core body temperature, but statistically speaking, we know that the offset is this much, and you just apply that to there. But there will be differences between humans, obviously. So now how Core does this is very different. They measure also the skin temperature, but in order now to say something about core temperature, they actually measure how much heat is being produced or basically radiated from the body, or the other way around, for example, but mostly basically radiated from the body. So think of it this way. If you have a cooking stove, if you put this sensor, of course, I wouldn't do it with the core because this is wrapped, of course, in plastic in order to be a little bit more friendly on the body. So I wouldn't advise you put it on the stovetop. But this technology, you can actually put this, if you had it, of course, now packed in, or let's say in metal instead, you could put this on top of your stovetop. So I'm simplifying it now, but you could put it on the stovetop. So if you put your stovetop now on 2 kilowatts, let's say 2,000 watts. So we already talk about watts when we are biking. But if you now put your stove on 2 kilowatts or 2,000 watts, for example, and you put this sensor on top there, before you put it on, it will just measure the surface temperature of the. So instead of skin temperature, it measures the surface temperature of your cooking stove. So let's say it's 20 degrees in the room, it will measure 20 degrees there. But when you start now to put on the power of your stove, temperature will of course start to go up, because this will start to now transfer or give away a lot of heat. So it's converting electrical energy into heat or thermal energy instead. And what this one then will basically measure is basically measuring that now there's actually coming off 2,000 watts of air in heat. So it measures the heat normalized for a certain area. So let's say square centimeter or square meter. Normally we normalize this as square meter. So then you now can imagine to take this now one step further. And that is that if you take this sensor and you attach it, let's say that inside a house, there's 20 degrees. You have a window, and outside the window, if you put your hand on that window now, it will probably not be as cold as the environment around. It will maybe have a little bit higher, and the reason for that is because there's leaking heat from the inside of the room out towards the window to the environment. And this is, of course, why we want to have windows with a very high insulation value. But if you now basically say that I know the insulation value of this window, then basically, when you put this sensor on there, you know that, okay, the surface temperature of this window now on the outside here is a certain temperature. But also because you're measuring how much power is being radiated to the environment, and you know the insulation value of the window, you can actually say what the temperature is inside of that room there. And that is actually one of the applications that technology is originally used to. It is to quantify the efficiency of, for example, insulation in houses, or energy efficiency of houses. So now what they did was that they started to train this system on humans to understand the insulation value of a human, and they use the same technology now to say what is the core temperature of the body. But what we have to be or know at the same time as well. If you take a temperature pill and you say that this is the gold standard, or a temperature probe, if you take the temperature probe and you put it up rectally, or you put it into the mouth, you will measure different temperatures. So if you take even the pill and you insert the pill rectally, and you swallow one at the same time as well, they will also measure differently. And the temperature slopes as well, as a function of the work you do, will also be differently, because they will have different distances from where maybe the work is being done. So if you're cycling, the rectal pill will be closer to your working muscles, while the pill that sits now in your stomach will be further away, and it will also be encapsulated in fluids and other things like this too. And that means also when you are doing work now, what we have to remember, 80% of the work we do is now being dissipated into one, body, which increasing the core temperature, and two, to the environment. And of course, the longer we measure, or the further we are away from this with that pill, or with a core sensor, of course there can be different offsets there, and there can be different slopes there. So I
guess that's the how, but I suppose what I'm trying to get my head around is nearly the why. Like how would knowing my core temperature impact my performance, or change my training prescriptions, or my pacing on race day?
Yeah, so that's where I'm getting, and that is that basically. What we now measure, we know with these technologies that we can also measure now, for example, like how much heat you're dissipating, but also now the core temperature of your body. And we know that, of course, there's a limit to how much energy or how much heat your body is capable of storing. So again, 80% of that calorie that you are using to propel yourself, or let's say of the 100% of a calorie that you're using to propel you forward, 20% go into forward propulsion, 80% goes into heat. And there's a certain amount to how much heat the body can tolerate before you will start to break down cognitively. You won't be able to work very efficiently anymore. And this is again where I can't necessarily tell you, if I just look at you saying that, okay, I can't say what power you should be at that day, for example. In the same way that I can't say necessarily what temperature you should go at that day. You basically have to test. So you have the sensor, and you have a power meter that will already give you a good indication. You don't even have to do a test. If you go out one day and you do a good ride, you'll start to sense when you are fatiguing, and then you know already there you have a pretty good understanding of whether this is a sustainable power output for a race or not. But that is also a function of how much heat you are producing as well, or what your core temperature also becomes.
Very interesting.
So when you have this sensor on there, you do the same. You start to see that you are approaching a certain core temperature, and you see, okay, in these kind of situations here, I know that I have to be careful when I'm starting to approach this, and maybe dial it off or be more cautious, or remind yourself about, I have to be now good with my fueling strategy, my cooling strategies, and these kind of things. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what kind of power output you think that you can output, because you will be limited also about how much heat the body can store before it starts to basically fatigue or break down.
And does it have an API that you can look at this as a data screen on your Garmin or your Wahoo or Hammerhead or whatever bike computer you're using?
Yeah, so this the core sensor. So core now is basically on your Wahoo, on your Garmin, on your watch, whatever. You can basically now actually have you can have that in real time. So you'll see in real time next to you, for example, your power meter. You'll actually see your core temperature, and you can start to see what is happening here with the.
I'm sold. I'm getting this.
Yeah. That for me, I can say that we are actually now I'm in Atlas Mountains. In 2 weeks' time, we are back into the laboratories in Bergen again, doing a repeated test now to see what have changed when we've been up in the Atlas Mountain. How have they responded? Of course, we do a lot of measurements here. They're using the technology, but then the guys actually, the guys from Core is actually coming to Norway, so they are actually with us there because we are continuously advancing our understanding, the technology to be able to do even more with it. So for me, you can think of it this way. Power on your power meter is the little brother. What the core sensor measures is actually the big brother of the calories that are being outputted. And that's why it is so important, and why it also is something that I'm constantly trying to understand better, because we also see the different strategies in even how you are executing your training on days. When are you putting the easy session? When you're putting the hard session? How do you stack them? How far away? We even see that this the technologies that sits behind the core helps us actually understanding even better also human efficiency as well.
I'm going to make the data screen 80% bigger for core temperature. Have you seen a company called Kitman Labs? You know who they are?
No. Maybe, but I don't. But I'm very bad with names.
I'd be interested to see if you guys are using something similar to this in triathlon. So Kitman Labs started as an Irish startup company, and now they're gone into the NFL, NBA, Premier League. So what they look at is athletes. They've hundreds of cameras around the training pitch. And say we'll take a soccer team analogy, because I know Real Madrid and stuff are using it now. So they have hundreds of cameras placed around the training pitch, and they will look at a player. So you take Cristiano Ronaldo. The cameras will take baselines of Cristiano Ronaldo. What time does it take him to accelerate from 0 to 20 kilometers an hour? What's his median height jump? And it takes hundreds of data points. And now in every match and every training session, it looks for deviations from those baseline points to predict when Cristiano Ronaldo is about to get injured. But they're predicting injury with shocking accuracy. So they can get like an extra 10 game days per year out of top player. I'm pulling that statistic out of the air, but they can get X amount of extra minutes and X amount of extra games per season using this kind of injury prevention technology. Is this something you think could have an application in triathlon, or is it already there?
It's already there, I would say, because actually your power meter, what most people don't actually understand or realize is that most or some of the power meters that are on the market today actually capture quite good biomechanical data. So they will already give you an output of how you are producing a certain power. So not only cadence and torque, but you can even go down into see how you produce the torque, for example, throughout the pedaling revolution. And when you start, and then you can break that even further down. So there you already can start to look at movement pattern quite accurately in cycling. And we do see a very strong correlation between that. And for example, when things are starting, either if there's something, so say for example, an athlete have traveled and they didn't set up their bike correctly after they traveled. So some people are more sensitive, and you can almost, like, I would see the data. So I would just ask my athlete, have you calibrated your power meter? That would be my first question, of course. And if they have done that, then it's like where I would say, okay, there is something here we can see here in the data. Have you adjusted your seat? And this is, of course, when you would just say, oh no, he didn't, for example. So that's to give one simple example. The same thing is actually now in running. The running power meters now, we are able to, we sample with extremely high frequency. So we even see the full three-dimensional footpath of an athlete, and we can see what is changing there. And that means, for example, if you, again, to use a simple example, let's say that you are starting to get an Achilles injury, for example, or something that you need to start to be cautious about. You might see that they are collapsing. So, for example, now in the movement pattern, they are starting to collapse easier. So they don't have the same, call it, springiness or efficiency, for example. And you start to see their imbalances, for example. So there definitely technology is starting to become close to or on par with cycling. And then in swimming, of course, this is a place where still we are more, technology needs more development. But there for example, one thing that we have been working, like cycling and running, you have a watch or you have a computer. Swimming, you don't have this. And of course, these tools are brilliant to use as a feedback, to pace yourself, to understand how you're executing, how are you on cadence, to just use a simple metric. But that has been lacking actually in swimming. And then we started working with a company called Form. This must have been now 1.5 years ago or something like that. And they made a goggle where there's a tracker. So there's plenty of trackers on the market. So it's not a problem to get a tracker that will promise you to track like different metrics when you're swimming. Like, for example, your distance per stroke, your stroke rate. It will even start to go deeper into the metrics, like saying intracyclic variations. You will basically see how you're accelerating and deaccelerating between the strokes, basically how you're rotating, for example. So we are also starting actually to get pretty good actually technology there that actually sits on the athlete to provide direct feedback or on there. We also use camera system. We use from some other suppliers that actually is invented in the Nordics too, where we have external camera systems and where we actually do sometimes when we want to have additional or redundant metrics. Then we start to put on dots on the athletes, and we are starting to use that as well to look at. But then that is not so much to use for injury prevention. Then it's purely to understand a technological component that we think that by being smart about it, we can increase the efficiency or the work economy of the athletes.
Interesting. To finish up and to circle right back to the start, we talked a lot about kilojoules on the bike. How do you go about planning an athlete's nutrition off the bike? Is there a macro breakdown you're looking to distribute across the day? Do you have RDAs you're looking for them to hit 1 gram of protein per every kilogram of body weight? How tightly assessed is this? Or are you giving the athletes guidelines and letting them kind of self-determine nutrition?
I think here it's important. There are, of course, many views and philosophies around this, and we have, again, Kristian and Gustav, the Olympic champions, world champions, and all across all distances, world record holders, and we have a very simple approach to this, and that is basically that the most important thing is calories in, or let's say calorie uptake, and how much calories you put out, and then making sure that we are a little bit in a surplus. So that's why you also see you see that they have a very healthy weight. They are by far not the skinniest athletes.
It strikes me initially like when I see them straight away. But if you have always a calorie surplus, is weight not just going to be creeping up?
No, the problem is that actually the guys, when you train 30 hours a week, you are not able to be in a calorie surplus. And because the mass, or let's say the volume of food that you actually have to eat, because again, we are eating something and it comes down into our stomach. So we can always talk about mass of food, but that really doesn't matter, because if the volume of that mass is huge, you're only able to eat a little bit of it because you don't have place in your stomach. So a limitation actually that I see with athletes when they are at this level is actually the sheer volume of food that you actually have to get into your body. So most athletes at elite level will be very often in a caloric deficit. You won't be a surplus, but you can't be in prolonged period in a caloric deficit if you want to promote growth. You have to make sure that you are in a balance and then also in a surplus in order to promote growth. So for me, first and foremost, is the most important thing is to ensure that they at least get in enough calories. And if they need to eat candy in order to be able to tolerate the volume of food that they have, then do that. But then, of course, secondly, we are, of course, wanting to have a healthy macro distribution across carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And for these athletes, we are probably closer to, I would say, now it's a little. We do this at Random Intervals. We do more tracking of this, but I would say, if I'm not mistaken, we are probably closer to 80% carbohydrates, 70 to 80% carbohydrates, and then a fairly even split between proteins and fats. But yes, you can. Energy is energy, and there needs to come energy in. So you can, but then again, there are people saying that calorie is not a calorie, and yeah, sure, I agree to that as well. Because you have to also remember and be humble about it. If you eat two different foods that are rated, that's the important part. Rated statistically with the same calorie amount, because of your microbiome in your body, or the microbiota in your body and so on, you will take up calories from some food, more calories, or let's say the bioavailability of the calories are higher in one food than another food with the same rated amount of calories. And this is not universal. This is different from human to human, because it has to do with what food have you been eating and all this kind of thing. And we know that, of course, like elite athletes, they very often have a more diverse bacteria flora in their stomach and intestines, purely because maybe they are eating much more food, and of course, since they are in deficit, the body also have to become more efficient at taking up calories as well from the food that you basically ingest. So this is, of course, then where a little bit like we going back to the performance model, to add one more component to that one, because there's actually, it's not only about calories in and calories out, or input, because the input really starts with calories. It starts really with calories in, but there is actually an efficiency part here as well, and is how much of those calories in are you able actually to take up in your body. And this
I had Professor Tim Spector on the podcast talking about this. He'd actually be an interesting guy for you to chat with. His expertise and PhD is around gut microbiome.
Yeah.
So he studies, as he will say, he's a shit doctor. He studies feces, and he's the world's largest collection of shit, where he just is looking at microbiome all day long. And it was a fascinating insight for me, because for a long time I held that belief that a calorie is a calorie.
Yeah, no. I, to put it, I that's exactly. So he's probably one of the more fascinating guys I know about because of his approach. But that's the same thing I also have to do for my athletes. If you really when you want to push the limit of peak human performance, you also, when you know that volume or calories that you are able to get in to make sure that you promote this growth as well, you need to understand that even better. And that means that you can't necessarily just go and do a sampling of the of the microbiome or the bacteria in a fecal sample, because that will only be an indicator. What you actually have to do, you have to go brute force about it, unfortunately still, and that means that you need to make let's say a true copy of the food that you're eating, and then you need to burn the sample of that to see how much calories are in there. And then basically afterwards, and then of course you have already, the rated calories, but now when you burn it, then you know how much calories are really like in it as well. That doesn't mean that all is available to the body. But then also what you have to do is that you can't just collect fecal samples. You have to collect all the feces for the athletes whether they have a diarrhea or whether they have whether they wake up in the night or whether it's out on a ride or whatever, you have to collect absolutely all feces from them over a certain period, and you have to burn that as well. And then you have to compare how much calories went in and how much calories went out, because this is basically your calorie uptake. How much of the calories were you able to take up as well? So it really starts there, and then of course it ends as distance per time.
So if anyone wants to take your job, coaching Kristian and Gustav, they're literally going to have to sift through their shit. That's why you're telling us.
Well, it's something that is not very viable. It's not very feasible or viable to do like continuously. It is so invasive into the life that it is something you can only do at random times, maybe over a couple of years, to see whether there is some changes and these kind of things. And then, of course, you know that even that is not statistically, because in 2 months' time, 3 months' time, because there are other things that are also influencing it, this can also be a little bit different, but it's not huge differences we are talking about there. But this is something, yes, of course, back to what motivates us, or what is the culture or the strategy. For me, it's about like continuously advancing and understanding peak human performance. What is the limitations, these kind of things. And this is also what the athletes have bought into, because we all have seen where this has brought us, and this is what also motivates us to continue this journey, because it is about this journey, this process of learning and always becoming better. I don't like to look at who was the fastest. We need to beat that guy. Much more fascinating for me is just to look at how fast can we actually go. Can we go even faster? Can we go 1% faster, 10% faster? Where is the limit to how fast humanity really can be in whatever modality they do?
Olav, it's a fascinating look into peak human performance, and you've been super generous with your time. Thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.